We're on the bottom of Daf Tzadi Vav Omer Aleph, and you'll see it 2 lines before the end of the Amud. The Mishnah says, Pesach L'Doros Noeg Kol Shiva. Very ambiguous statement in the Mishnah that has to be interpreted. Amai Koi asks the Gemara, what is this referring to? I mean, what does it mean, Pesach L'Doros Kol Shiva? Pesach L'Doros is only eaten for the first night. Ilema Pesach, he can't be referring to Korban Pesach because Pesach called Shiva Mi'ika. I mean, the Korban Pesach is only eaten for one night. And here we turn to Daf Tzadi Vavam and Beis Ella, but rather we have to assume that when the Tana mentions Pesach L'Doros, that's Noe Kol Shiva, he's referring to Chametz. It's not referring to the Korban Pesach, but rather to the Iser of Achilas Chametz. Now, the Mishnah sets up a contrast between Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach L'Doros. So is the Tana therefore telling me that Pesach Mitzrayim, which is Noeg B'Laila, it's only one night, and that means that the Iser Chametz is only for the one night, as opposed in contrast to Pesach Mitzrayim, which has an Iser Chametz for 7 days, Michlal, the Pesach Mitzrayim Laila Echad V'Su Lo. Is it really so that the Mishnah is telling me that the Iser Chametz with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim is only Laila Echad? That can't be. Why not? For Asanya, we have a price of Rabbi Yossi Aglilo Meminayin Le Pesach Mitzrayim She'ein Chimuto Noeg El Yom Echad. I could add the word Bilvad. Yom. Yom means not only the night, but also the next day. And how do I know this? Talmud Lomar, because the pasuk says, "V'lo ye'achel chametz," and then Samachle immediately afterwards it says, "Hayom atem yotzim," and the word Hayom indicates that the Iser of lo ye'achel chametz applies not only by night but also by day. And that's what we derive from the tzmichus of lo ye'achel chametz, and Hayom atem yotzim. So the Iser chametz in Pesach Mitzrayim was noeg for the entire first day, not just at night. So therefore, we have to find another interpretation of our Mishnah. And the Gemara answers, Elahachi ka'amar. This is what the Mishnah had in mind with regard to Pesach Mitzrayim. That nechal, right, the mitzvah of eating a bechipazon, v'layla echad, v'hu adin lePesach doros, that for all eternity, the Pesach can only be eaten at night, but for chimutzo kol hayom, as far as Pesach Mitzrayim, the entire 24 hours, including not only the night, but also the day that follows, is prohibited in Chametz. But Pesach L'Doros, here's the consciousness, Noe Kol Shiva, the Iser of Chametz applies all 7 days. Now this brings us to the Mishnah here, on Daf Tzadi Vav Amid Beis, which addresses the law of Tmura. It's very interesting that this Mishnah is almost a hemshech of Masechta Tmura as it applies to the Korban Pesach. What is Tmura? When a person has in front of him, let's say, for example, a Korban Ola, and he has an animal that's chulin, and he turns to the animal that's chulin, and he says, Harei zu Tmuras zu, that this behemas chulin should replace the behemas ola. He can't do that. But what he can do as a result of this tmura, which is a violation of a law, but nevertheless, is that in a sense he's matpis the kedushas behemas ola onto the chulin. And now the chulin becomes sanctified with the law of, or the status of a korban ola. And this is based on a pasuk in Vayikra Chav Zayin. It says, "V'im hamer yamir behema b'behema, v'yahu utma so yeh kodesh." In other words, even though his idea was to transfer the kedusha, that he can't do, he can't remove kedusha aguf. So now the original behema that was kodesh remains kodesh, and the one that he was meimer also becomes kodesh. And that's called the Hayahu Utmarasi Kodesh. Now, in the case of a Korban Pesach, if he turned to the Korban Pesach and he has another lamb that's chulin, and he says this lamb of chulin should be tmuras ha-pesach, then he can't be makriv that tmura l'shem Pesach because you're only bringing one Pesach, you don't bring two. So what do you do with this tmura? So the din is that you bring it as a korban shlomim. And in that sense, tmuras Pesach has the same halach, the same din as Mosar Pesach. What's Mosar Pesach? He designates the first lamb, and then it gets lost. He designates a replacement lamb, and then he finds the first lamb. That's called Mosar Pesach, which is brought as a korban shlomim. So to tmuras Pesach, which cannot be brought as a korban Pesach because he already has a korban Pesach. He can't bring two. That tmuras shlomim, that tmuras Pesach becomes shlomim. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Shamati sheyesh tmuras Pesach kreva v'yesh tmuras Pesach she'ena kreva. In other words, tmuras Pesach sometimes is considered shlomim, and you bring it as such as a korban shlomim, and sometimes tmuras Pesach cannot be brought on the mizbeach at all, as is. So what do? Tira ad shetipa bo mum. We bring it out to the pasture area until finally it gets a mum. And then we sell it on the open market, like Sulei HaMukdoshim, and the money is earmarked for a korban shlomim. But the Ainli Lefarish, she says, I can't seem to put this all together, says Rabbi Yeshua. I don't know which is the case of Tmuras Pesach that can be brought on the Mizbeach, and which Yirat Sheis Toiv, V'yipol Bo Mum, etc., cannot be brought on the Mizbeach. So Rabbi Akiva now comes along to explain when you apply Krevel Mizbeach and when do you apply Eino Krevel Mizbeach. Ani Afaresh. He says the following. This case in the Mishnah of Tmuras Pesach is missing one piece of the puzzle. We thought that Tmuras Pesach means that he looks at the lamb, which is chulin, and he says, Harezu Tmuras Pesach. No. This is a more complicated scenario. What happens is Pesach she'ovad, the original korban Pesach got lost, and now he designates a replacement korban Pesach, v'nimtza, and now he finds the original korban Pesach. So now the original korban Pesach becomes Mosar Pesach, and he takes this Mosar Pesach and he does an act of Tmura from a lamb of chulin onto Mosar Pesach. And now the question is, what do we do with this Tmura? So it depends. Nimtza kodem shchitas ha-Pesach, if he finds the original korban Pesach that was lost before he checks the second korban Pesach, the replacement one, is then Yira ad she'istoi. The original korban Pesach cannot be brought on the mizbeach. It does not become a korban shlomim under the law of Mosar Pesach, but rather ad she'istoi, as we said before, we send it out to the pasture land until it gets a mum, and then we sell it off. And the monies that come in are earmarked for a korban shlom. Why is this so? Why is it that if he shechts the korban Pesach Sheni after he found and relocated the Pesach Rishon does not come under the halacha of Mosar Pesach to be brought as Shlomim, but rather we have to do this whole thing. And the answer is because since he found the original Pesach before Shchita, now he's got two animals in front of him, both of which were designated as a korban Pesach, each of which. And now he shechts, in this case, the Sheni. That's called Bechia Biyodayim. he has now, so to speak, rejected the original Korban Pesach. And as such, it's not considered Mosar Pesach. Once there's a Dechia, it cannot be brought on its own as a Korban Shlom. It's what you call Pesach Dochli. V'chein Tmuraso. Now we get back to the Mishnah, says Rabbi Akiva. Now you have that original Korban Pesach which you found before Shechita, meaning before you shechted the second replacement Korban. And now you turn to a lamb that's chulin, and you say Arezu Tmuras, that Pesach, which was Nidches. And in such a case, V'chein Tmuraso, the same thing that applies to the Korban Pesach itself now applies to the Tmura. Which means that if it has the din of the original Pesach, then it can't be brought as Shlomim, but rather Yira Ad She'Yistai. So basically, whatever status you have on the Korban Pesach, when you're Meimir, the Tmura will have that identical status. If it was Liachar Shchitas HaPesach, if he shechted the second replacement, after he lost the first Korban Pesach, and he only found it after Shechita, so there was never a Dichui B'Yadayim, then Karev Shlomim, the Korban Pesach itself, when he finds it, can be brought and will be brought as a Korban Shlomim. And therefore, the Tmura, V'chein Tmura, so will be brought as a Korban Shlomim. So now Rabbi Akiva says, I understand the riddle here of Rabbi Yeshua. I know exactly when the Tmuras HaPesach can be brought and when the Tmuras HaPesach cannot be brought. And it all depends, it's all a reflection of the status of the Pesach itself on which he was Meimir, which was Pesach number 1 that got lost. Is that Pesach royal Mizbeach, can it be brought as a Korban Shlomim? Well, that depends. If there was Dichui B'Yadayim, which means that they relocated the first Korban that jumped away at the time when they shechted the second Korban, the replacement, that's called Dichui B'Yadayim, and such a Pesach does not have the status of Mosar Pesach. It's only Yirad She'Yistai. We cannot bring it on the Mizbeach. And Hu Adin, if he was Meimir on that Korban Pesach, which is not Mosar Pesach because there was Dichui B'Yadayim, cannot be brought on the Mizbeach. But if he found the Korban Pesach, the original one, after he shechted the Pesach Sheni, the replacement Pesach, which means that there was no Dichui B'Yadayim, then the status of the first Pesach is that of Mosar Pesach, and the status of the Meimir is identical, the Tmura, to the original Korban Pesach, and it can be brought as Shlomim. So the Gemara now asks the following question. Once we have the explanation of Rabbi Akiva as far as the din of Tmura is concerned, it all depends upon the status of the Pesach. Why didn't Rabbi Yeshua just say that I heard that a Pesach is Karev and I heard that a Pesach is Eino Karev? Why did Rabbi Yeshua introduce this very complicated second generation case, the scenario where he went and he was Meimir? This distinction as to whether the Pesach is Mosar Pesach can be brought as a Shlom or not applies to the Pesach itself. When did he find the Pesach? Did he find it before or after the Shechita of the replacement? My answer is Hakamash Malon. There's a chidush here that the Mishnah tells me by mentioning the scenario of Tmura, to Ika Tmuras Pesach, the low kreva, that there is an entity in halacha of a Tmuras Pesach, and yet it cannot be brought as Shlomim. I would have said that a Tmuras Pesach is never Nidches. Okay, you would doche the original Korban Pesach, but you never did a Dechia on the Tmura. So when you wanted to add a Kedushas Korban Pesach to the Tmura, we can cut the umbilical cord to the Pesach itself. It doesn't have to be identical to the Pesach. And even though the Pesach cannot be brought as Shlomim because it is Nidches, that doesn't apply to the Tmura. And the reason for that is because when you designated that lamb, which is chulin, as a tmura to the Korban Pesach, at that point, what status does tmuras Pesach have? It's not a Pesach. Tmuras Pesach is shlamim. So from the moment that you designated this tmura as a tmura Pesach, it became a Korban shlamim. And as such, we can be makriv it on the Mizbeach as a Korban shlamim. So the Mishnah comes to tell me a big chiddush over here, that even towards Pesach, which from the get-go with shlamim, it's very possible that we won't be able to bring it as a korban shlamim, because we have a Shem Pesach, and not only Shem Pesach, we have Shem Pesach Dochui. And that's the big chiddush here of our Mishnah, that you can have a Tmuras Pesach, which is not shlamim, but rather it is Tmuras Pesach, and in this case, Pesach is Dichui, hence it cannot be brought on the Mizbeh. Itmar, now the Gemara presents a machlokas between Rabbah and Rabbi Zera. Rabbah Omar, when it says in the Mishnah that we differentiate between whether or not we found the original Korban Pesach before the Shechita or not, Shaninu is Kodem Shechita li achar Shechita Shaninu. I'm going to interpret the Mishnah literally, and the Mishnah says Kodem Shechita. So in other words, what's happening is that even though he found the original Korban Pesach that got lost after the Shechita of the replacement Korban, which means that at the moment of the Shechita, again of the replacement, the second Pesach, he was Kovea the Rishon as a Korban Pesach. Just 1 second. It says Kodem Shchitas Hasheni. Oh, so I was emphasizing the Liachar Shchita case. Let's go back to the Kodem Shchita. One second. Again, I just got to get the cheshbon. Give me a second. It is the case of this case. I'm just going to read to you. This is a summary of Rashi's interpretation of Rabbah. So we'll do it together. He says the following: that when it says in the Mishnah that we differentiate between Nimta Kodem Shchita and Nimta Liachar Shchita, Shaninu, we'll take it literally. Shezman Shchita Shel Hasheni Hu HaKovea Es HaRichon B'Shem Pesach V'Docha Osa. Okay, that's what we saw in the Mishnah. That let's focus all our attention at the moment of Shechita, and we'll determine whether there's Dechia on Pesach Rishon. Was the Pesach Rishon available? It was found or not? Hischaresh Bekach. Oh, Shafilu Im Hoya Rishon Avud B'Shas Chatzos V'Nimtza Kodem Shchitas HaPesach. Meaning of the Sheni is Kova Shasa Shchita B'Shem Pesach Ubekach Kishemakar V'Sasheni V'Lo Oso Docheu B'Yadayim. So we're talking about the case of Kodem Shchita. And Rabbah says there's a big chiddush. Why? Because I would have said that since it had a Shem Pesach at the time of Chatzos, and then he found it before the Shechita of the Sheni, that Shechita generates a Shem Pesach, and it becomes now Dichui. So, Filim Hoya Rishon Avud B'Shas Chatzos. He doesn't spell it out clearly. I'm just trying to. Nimtza Kodem Shchita. We'll get it clear when we get to Reb Zera, but I just wanted to figure out these words. Nimtza Kodem Shchita Sasheni. Kovash Shchita B'Shem Pesach. And there is a dichui biyadayim as a result of being makriv the sheni. I'm going to try to suggest what I think he means, but again, it'll be clearer. We'll have to hold out till we see Reb Zera, who disagrees with Rabbah, that I would have said that there's no din dichui here. Why? Because where was the Pesach at the time of the Chiyuv HaKrova, meaning Chatzos, when the mitzvah of Shchitas HaPesach emerges? The first Pesach was lost. Okay, he found it before Shechita, but if it was lost, it already has a full-fledged Shem Pesach, and you can't later on be docha it because at the critical moment of when the Chiyuv Shechita emerges, it was nowhere to be found. So the concept of dichui applies when you have a Pesach and you doch it. But here, at the time of the Chiyuv Shechita, which means Chatzos, you didn't have this Korban Pesach. And therefore, at the moment of Chiyuv, there's no dichui. You can only be docha something that you have. Let's clarify it more when we see Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera Omar, Kodem Chatzos Liachar Chatzos Shanim. You have to rewrite the text of the Mishnah. And when Rabbi Akiva differentiates between finding the Korban Pesach and not finding the Pesach, he's talking about Kodem Chatzos and Liachar Chatzos. Why? Because Shas Chatzos, Sheba Hu Roy Li Karev L'Shem Pesach, Ovas B'Shem Pesach. Therefore, Im Nimtza Kodem Chatzos, Nikba hu bechatzos b'shem Pesach, v'kasher makrus hasheni v'lo oso, docheu b'yodayin. So in other words, Rabbi Zera says that this mechanism called dechia b'yodayin, that undermines the status of the first Korban Pesach as Motzar Pesach and Shlomim, that only applies if there was a Pesach at the time of Chatzos. So once you have a Pesach at the time of Chatzos, because you found the Korban before Chatzos, now it's a full-fledged Pesach, you found it, and now when you go in and you shech the second replacement Korban Pesach, now you're being docha the first Korban Pesach. But im nimtza liachar Chatzos, then even if you found it before Shechita, it's not nikva b'shem Pesach because it was lost at the time of the chiyuv korban, which means that chatzos, and therefore it's not excluded and disqualified under the halacha Mosar Pesach, and you could bring it as a korban shlom. So the Gemara asks, "Ulerab zera haktani kodem shchitas haPesach, ema zman shchitas haPesach," and the Gemara says, "Kitanoi." This machlokas between Rabbah and Rabbi Zera is in fact a machlokas tanoi, And here's the lashon of the brisa: HaPesach shenimtza kodem shchita. Okay, this reflects Rabba's shita. It all depends upon whether you found it before shchita or after shchita. Is yiroeh, then there's dichui, and you can't bring it. But liachar shchita, if you only found the Pesach Rishon after you shech the Pesach Sheni, then Yikrav is brought b'tor shlom. That's the Tanakama, that's Rab. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Kodem Chatzos Yireh, Liachar Chatzos Yikrav. Everything depends upon whether you found the Korban Pesach before or after Chatzos. If you found it before Chatzos, then later on the Shechita could be Doche, the Korban Pesach. But if it wasn't even available at the time of Chatzos, it was completely lost, then even if he shechted at a time where he had access to the first Korban, there's no din of Dichui, because as we said before, this Pesach at the time of Chatzos was not available. It's not a Korban Pesach. And that reflects the Shita Rabbi Zera. Okay. Now we get to Rav, two Lashonos of Rav. Omar Rav, this is the Lishna Kama of Rav. Lo Shanu, when did we learn in the Seifa, right? It says in the Seifa that Achar Shchitas HaPesach, Karev Shlomim V'chein Tmurasa. That only applies Ela Shenimtza Achar Hashchita Vehemerbo Achar Hashchita. Rava is operating with an identity between the Pesach and its Tmura. So if you found, so under what condition can you be makriv the Tmura? That's if the Pesach itself lends itself to the status of Tmuras Pesach, which is Shlomim, and can be brought on the Mizbeach, which means that you located the Pesach Rishon after the Shechita Pesach Sheni. Aval nimtza kodem Shechita, if you found the Pesach Rishon before the Shechita, and then we said there's a din of Dichui, so that the Pesach itself could not be brought as most of Pesach Shlomim, the Hamer Bo, and now he tries to be Memer. And when did he do the Tmura? It was Li'achar HaShchita. Nevertheless, you cannot bring this Tmura on the Mizbeach. Why? Because Tmuraso Mikol Kedusha D'Chuyakasi. We identify the status of the Tmura with the status of the Pesach. The Pesach was already Dachui, and it can no longer be brought as Shlomim as a Mosa Pesach. And so too, the Tmura has the identical status, even though again he did the Maisa Tmura after the Shechita, but it's irrelevant because he had the Pesach Rishon available at the time of the Shechita, and therefore when he shechted the Pesach Sheni, he was Docha the Pesach Rishon. Once he was Docha, the Pesach Rishon is excluded from the Mizbeach, and now even Liachar Shechita, if he was Meimir, then the Tmura has the identical status as the Kedusha, the original Kedusha, which means the Korban Pesach, and therefore it's excluded from the Mizbeach. Esvei Abaye asked a kash from a brisa in a parsha of Shlomim, Vayikra Perek Gimel. It says Im Kesev Umakriv, and the words Im Kesev are superfluous. Matam Alom Im Kesev. What do we derive from the word Im, which is redundant? And the brisa answers L'Rabos Tmuras HaPesach Achar HaPesach Shekreva Shlomim. So we're talking about a Tmura, a Bema Shahumra, B'Pesach, and which was this Pesach? It was the Pesach Rishon after you shechted the Pesach Sheni, and it's Kreva Shlomim, Hechidam. So Abai says, what's the scenario? Elam, if you're going to say Shenimtza Li'achar Shechita, if we're talking about a case that the first Pesach was lost, but it was found after you shechted the replacement Pesach, the Hamer Bo, and then he does Tmura, that's Pshita. Achar Shechita Pshita. I don't need the brisa to tell me that this tmura, this kreva, can be brought as shlamim, because the Pesach itself is called Mosar Pesach, can be brought as shlamim. So certainly the tmura should be no worse off. So lamali kra, and yet the brisa derives this from the extra word im. Elolah, by process of elimination, we're talking about nimtza kodem shchita, that you found and you located the Pesach Rishon before shchita, and you did the tmura liachar shchita. So you shechted already the replacement carbon, and then you had already done a dichui on the Pesach Rishon because you found the Pesach Rishon before shchita, and now Hamer bo liachar shchita. And the pasuk is teaching me that even though at the moment that he was memir, the Pesach Rishon was dachui, nevertheless we could be makriv the Tmuras HaPesach. Why? Because the Tmura took place after the Shechita. And that's what this brisa is established based on the Im Kesef. And that's directly in contradiction to Rava. So Rava answers lowly, Olam, the brisa is talking about Nimtza Achar HaShechita, which means that the Pesach Rishon itself is kosher b'tor shlomin as a Tmura, as a Mosar Pesach. Now, Hamer Bo, Liachar Shchita, again, in the same period of time, he did Tmura. You asked me, that's Pshita, that you could be makriv of the Tmura. If you could be makriv of the original Pesach, how much more so the Tmura? Cross machta b'alma. This brisa did not intend to derive this halacha from the word im, but it's only an asmachta. It's a remez to a davar shel Torah. So Gemara asks, okay, now you're telling me that the word im, kesef, is not going to be darshan, it's only nismachta. So what do I do with that word im? It is sanya, and we have a different drasha that we found in a brisa. The brisa says, kesef, l'rabos es a pesach li alya. And this teaches us that your makriv, the aliyah, which is kind of like the tail of the Pesach, and kishu omer im kesev, what is the im, which l'chora is completely superfluous? It's teaching me l'rabos Pesach she'ovra shnasa. So again, we would have to understand exactly why there was a havamina that the aliyah of the Pesach is not brought on the Mizbeach, but in any event, the brisa here is learning from the word kesef that the aliyah of the Pesach is also brought on the Mizbeach. And we're learning another halacha, and that's called Pesach she'ovra shnasa, which means that he was mafresh a lamb which was less than a year old, but by the time he brought it on the Mizbeach, it was after the year, or shlomim aboim machmas Pesach, meaning Mosar Pesach, l'chol mitzvahs shlomim. And in these cases, we're going to give it a din of shlomim. So number one is a Pesach Shavra Shnoso, number two is a Pesach Aboim Machmas Pesach. Now, what does it mean that we say in these cases it has all the dinim of shlomim and not Pesach? Number one, sheton smicha. There's no smicha on a carbon Pesach, but there is on shlomim. Sachim, which means this keyayin and solus with shemen, are brought to accompany a shlomim, not a Pesach. Utnufas chazav of chazav shok. There's a halach of tnufa in chazav shok. Ukshu omer v'im eis. In that same parsha in Vayikra Gimel, Ifsika Inyan, the limit ala eis she'eno ein te'una aliyah, that we don't bring the aliyah of the eis on the Mizbeach like we do in the case of a keves. So this is the Lishna Kama of Rava, in which case Rava is commenting on the Seifa, and when the Seifa says that you can be makriv the tmuras Pesach, right? That's only in a case of nimtzali achar shchita, that the Pesach Rishon was found before or after the shchita, and therefore it itself can be brought as Mosar Pesach as Shlomim on the Mizbeach. So to the Tmura of that Pesach, which has the identical status, can be brought on the Pesach. But if, on the other hand, you located the Korban Pesach before the Shechita, the Pesach now is excluded mitzad dichui from the normal halacha of Mosar Pesach. It cannot be brought at Shlom on the Mizbeach, and therefore, if you were Meimer, even after the Shechita, the Tmura can likewise not be brought on the Mizbeach. But Ika Demasni Lea Reisha, now Rabbah becomes a Mekil, and he's going back to the Reisha. It says in the Reisha Pesach She, meaning Sha'ovad, V'hifish M'kom Pesach V'nimtza Kodem Shchitas HaPesach. If you find the Korban Pesach Rishon before you shechted, now this Dichui is then Yirad Shistovi Mocher V'yovi B'dmav Shlomim. V'chein B'tmura, and the Mishnah says the same status of exclusion, of disqualification applies to the Tmura. Amar Rava, Lo Shana, when do we say that the din of Dichui applies not only to the Pesach itself, but also to its Tmura? That's Ella, that only applies Shenimtza Kodem HaShchita V'gam Heimer Kodem HaShchita. The Tmura was effectuated before the Shchita. So the Dichui now is Chal, not only on the Korban Pesach itself, the original, meaning Pesach Rishon, but even on its Tmura. Aval nimtza kodem hashchita v'hemer bo liachar hashchita. According to this second Mishnah, Rava is separating the process and the status of the Pesach itself, which means Dichui in this context, as opposed to the act of Tmura. So that he found the Korban Pesach Rishon before Shechita of the Pesach Sheni, and therefore Dichui is Chal. But the Tmura took place after Shechita, is then, says Rav in the Lishna Basra, Tmuraso Kreva Lishlomit. This is a big chiddush. We always assumed an equation identity between the Tmura and the original, and here the original is Apostle of Mizbeach as Shlomim, right? That's the Pesach Sheni, Pesach Rishon. Whereas the Tmura is Kashel of Mizbeach. My timer. Ki kava shchita b'midi de chazile. Midi de lo chazile lo kava. When do you have halach of dichui? And therefore, at the time of the shchita, you can effectuate a dichui and passel it with mizbeach. That's only b'midi de chazile. You had something that was royal mizbeach, and now you were doche. But midi lo chazile, you weren't even makdish the lamb. You had a lamb of chulin at the time of shchita. So you want to say the shechita of the Pesach Sheni is now generating a dichui. A dichui on what? On a behemoth that's chulin? That can't be. Abaye raised the objection from that same brisa that we had before against Rav, but now it's Rav in the Lishna Basra. It says in the pasuk in Parsha Shlomim, Vayikra Gimel, Im Kesev, and we said that word Im is redundant. What is Im teaching us? L'rabos Tmuras HaPesach Achar HaPesach. He did a Tmura on a Pesach vis-a-vis a Pesach Rishon after they shechted the Pesach Sheni. Shekreva Shlom. Now we turn to Daf Sadi Zayin. Yochel, I would say, af lifnei Pesach, that if the Tmura of a Pesach Sha'avad was found, right, the Pesach Sha'avad was found before lifnei Shchita of the Pesach Sheni replacement, and then we're going to say that you could be makriv this Tmura as Shlomim, which is exactly Rav and the Lishna Basra. Talmud Lomar, it says who. In the parsha, it says V'amartem Sevach Pesach who. And once again, the word who is superfluous. Who karev v'ein tmuras Pesach kreva. Pesach itself is kosher and can be brought, but not the tmura. So Abai says, Hechidami, what's the case over here? Elam, if you're talking about a case, Shenimta Kodem Ashchita Vehemer Bo, is Kodem Ashchita Pshita. I certainly understand on my own, I don't need a drasha for this, that you cannot be makriv the tmura as a korban shlamim, because it was already set up as a shem pesach, and there was dichlu, because they did the tmura before the shchita. Once he does the tmura before the shchita, he generates a kedushas shem pesach, and is dichlu because he went ahead now and shechted the pesach sheni. The lomali kra elalav by process of elimination shenimtza kodem shchita. That we're talking about a case where he found the Pesach Rishon before Shechita, but Hamer Boli Achar Shechita, which is exactly Rava's scenario. And the pasuk is telling me that this Tmura is excluded, disqualified from the Mizbeach. It cannot be brought as Shlomim, whereas Rava says that since he did the Tmura after the Shechita, therefore the Dichui couldn't have generated any psul in the carbon when it was a lamb that was chulin, and now he's meimir the lamb after shchita, and therefore it's kosher l'mizbeach. Gemara says tiyufta de rava tiyufta. This raya from this brisa cannot be answered. You cannot reconcile that with Rav. Okay, so let's just make a note of where we got up to here. We're on Daf Tzadi Zayin Amud Aleph, and we're up to Amar Shmuel, which is approximately 2, 3, 4, 6, 7 lines down from the top. And that's a brand new sugya that Bali Neder will be able to study tomorrow. Now, since we have Kriyas HaMegillah tomorrow,